Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class. I hope you guys are doing well. No one has their camera on, so can someone confirm for me that you guys are seeing the PowerPoint in front of me and you guys can hear me?
I hear you.
Cool. Thank you all. What up? So actually, I'm sharing the wrong thing. I wanted to start today by addressing some of the questions that came up on Tuesday about bone tissue, and then the questions that came up on Thursday about osteogenesis imperfecta. So did I correctly switch over? You guys seeing these questions with red? Cool. So first off, the questions from Tuesday. Somebody was asking about if osteoclasts are more active in certain bones, thus would those bones be broken down more quickly or first before other bones? And then a question about the structure of teeth. I looked for a while trying to find an answer about the osteoclasts question and couldn't find anything that actually addresses it. Um, couldn't find any studies that were focused on are osteoclasts more active in certain bones or not. Everything that was coming up was just generally talking about the function of osteoclasts and bone remodeling. So unfortunately, I did not find any significant answer to that question. If anyone else is able to find a resource that does, please share it with me, because it seems like there should be, where it would just make sense. It makes sense to me logically that there would be some bones that would be preferentially broken down over others, but didn't find any strict answer to that. And then for the structure of teeth, teeth apparently are not considered bone, and that differentiation is due to the fact that there are not living cells within the major structure of teeth. So they're made up of the same basic stuff, just without the cells. So you still have, there's all matrix, essentially. It's the hydroxyapatite crystals and collagen fibers. And then the concentration of those hydroxyapatite crystals to the collagen fibers just differs for the different portions of the tooth. So I can pull up what that looks like. I actually don't know if this, yeah, okay, cool. It still has you in that window. So the outermost part of the tooth that is visible or superficial to the gum is the enamel, which is the hardest substance in the human body. This is almost pure hydroxyapatite crystal. So very, very dense, very, very tough. Underneath that is the dentin, which similarly is mostly hydroxyapatite crystal, just a bit less of a concentration. And so it's a bit softer. And that's what gives the yellowish hue to our teeth. As the enamel is breaking down, more of that dentin is visible through those crystals, and that looks yellow. Of course, there's other things like staining from the foods that we're consuming, like coffee, dark colored foods leaving behind their pigments that get stuck in the enamel. And then you have the pulp at the very core, which is what serves and innervates some of the cells that are in this pulp. So we've got blood vessels and nerves that come up into that pulp. And then the roots of these teeth are just sitting into the mandible, into little pockets in your mandible. And they're held there by ligaments, by these periodontal ligaments. So very similar to bone, but not considered bones themselves. And since they aren't made up of cells, we don't have any of our regulatory osteoblasts and osteoclasts in here. They can't regenerate themselves. Okay? And so you have to go see a dentist or a specialist, or someone has to treat that in order to replace what is broken down or damaged. It will not naturally regenerate the way your bones and muscles would, and skin, etc., all of your other tissue. So pretty cool. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say there. And so then for the questions that you guys left on your worksheets about the case study on osteogenesis imperfecta, I know some students shared answers towards the end of class too, but just wanted to touch back on them. So would compact bone or spongy bone be affected more by this disorder? From what I was finding, it should be the same. It was this research kind of was coming up similar to my research on if osteoclasts are more active in any bones. I didn't find anything that directly answers that question. And so just going logically based on the structure of spongy and compact bone, right? They're made up of the same stuff. And since osteogenesis imperfecta is addressing the collagen that's supposed to be making up part of the matrix, the organic portion of the matrix of both bone types, they should be affected generally the same. I guess the outcome of that degenerated collagen might look different and feel different because the organization of that bone is different in compact versus spongy bone. We don't have any osteons in spongy bone. They have these branches or trabeculae instead. But the collagen malfunction should be active in both, or should be affecting both types. So you should get dysfunction for both spongy and compact bone from that disorder. Okay. Asking about, can this be diagnosed prenatally? So yes, and they can do this in a few different ways. This is really only looked for if there is a known familial connection that someone else in the family had this disorder, or if there is really obvious differences or abnormalities in the bone size when looking at an ultrasound. So it can be found through ultrasound via just measuring the size of those bones. They can also take cell samples from the blood, from the bone itself, to either analyze the density of that bone, or analyze in the cells the DNA, and look for that mutation, look for that gene defect. So yes, this can be diagnosed prenatally. The treatment options for osteogenesis imperfecta are just physical therapy and rod implants. Something we didn't talk a lot about last week that I meant to discuss and wanted to discuss is that the osteoblast, let me switch back over to the PowerPoint on bone. The osteoblasts that sit in these little lacunae, these little lacunae, they have those extensions, these canaliculi. These are extensions of their plasma membrane all throughout the bone. And the movement of the cytoplasm through these lacunae within that cell tells the bone, tells those other cells basically where a lot of the pressure and movement of your body is happening. And so more pressure on your bones is going to stimulate more calcium deposition and more collagen production. So the more we put stress on our bones, the denser our bones will build in response to that, which is really important and really cool, right? How your bones regulate their density and size to try to keep up with what you're experiencing throughout your environment. And why did I bring that up? Oh, because of physical therapy. So if we're having issues with our bones building themselves correctly, some of that careful weight-bearing exercise can help with stimulating more production. The most common treatment would be implants with metal rods, to kind of replace what the structure of that bone was supposed to be doing in the first place. The next question was life expectancy, or common causes of death with this disorder. So for the most common version of OI, which is type 1, it's estimated 50% of patients with OI are type 1. This is the mildest version of OI that can be treated if caught early with things like physical therapy and rod implants. And the overall life expectancy for someone with type 1 would be the typical life expectancy of someone without it. Just obviously the symptoms and effects of that disorder will still be felt. Type 4 would be the next mildest version. And depending on what resource you find, some people list up to 8 different types of OI, just based on the severity and some of the commonalities between their symptoms. So type 4 being the next mildest would only have a slightly shortened lifespan, but then type 3 and type 2 are quite fatal. So the average lifespan for a baby born with type 3 OI is around 10 years. And then there really isn't a lifespan or an expected lifespan for a baby born with type 2 OI. They typically die either before or shortly after birth because of the severity of those bone deformities. And so that's also plays a role in the naming of these types, the severity of it, and the expected life expectancy that goes along with it. So it varies. In most patients, it's a typical lifespan or just a slightly shortened lifespan. These severe versions are much less common because, of course, as we've said, with a dominant gene causing a disorder. If it is fatal, it's not likely to survive to be passed on to the next generation. So these other types that are fatal are much less common. Okay, and then lastly, why the heart-shaped face? I was hoping for a more detailed answer when I was looking this up, but it's just changes in structure to the bone, the same way that the structures of the long bones and flat bones are being changed, right? A lot of the shape of our face is due to the various bones that make up our face. And so if the shape and size of those bones is being affected by dysfunctional collagen, then that is going to give a whole different face shape. So they call it triangular because it kind of gets pushed in. We kind of actually look that up. Oh, there we go. Okay, this is what they're referring to with that kind of like triangular face. Okay, but not always exactly a triangle, right? Just other changes to the facial shape because the bones aren't forming the way they would have before. Okay. Any questions or things I can expand on from those? Okay. Thank you guys for asking difficult questions that I don't know the answer to, because I love having that as something to get me started on researching more and learning more about these things myself. So I really appreciate it. Okay. So this week's lecture content is on chapter 9, which kind of overlaps with what we were discussing in lab last week, all about our articulations and types of movement that are happening in the body. So I want to do some quick reflection. Oh, that didn't work the way I wanted it to. Okay. By the way, did I correctly get you guys back to the slide deck? Are we seeing the slide deck? Awesome. So I'm going to start by just generally discussing these questions to kind of build up to the information we're going to talk about and expand on. And so first off, what are articulations? What would we be referring to by an articulation?
Is it where bones meet? Like
Sure, yeah, right.
the
We've been
junction
talking
between
about
bones?
articulating surfaces and which bone articulates with what, right? Yeah, an articulation is basically just where bones meet. And so we have another more common word for an articulation, which is in the name of this PowerPoint, in the name of this module, which is joints. And so different articulations, different meeting points between bones are going to serve slightly different functions. And so what function would you expect a joint to serve? If this is where bones meet each other, what function would that structure need to be able to provide?
Movements.
So movement. Do we think that all bones need to move where they meet each other? Yeah, some head. Cool. Yeah. So not all of our joints are going to be movable. So movement is going to be one function that some of our joints serve, and where we're going to be spending most of our time talking about, because that's the most complex and diverse part of these articulations is how they move. But what else would be important about this meeting point between two bones?
To allow deformation and compression.
Yeah, so resistance to stressors, like with deformation and compression, right? And just holding them together, right? Making sure our skeleton doesn't just fall apart. And so we do have particular structures that play a role in each of those functions. But altogether, basically, it is those three things. Right? So allowing for movement, allowing for dispersion of force and resisting pressure, and then keeping our bones together so that our skeleton doesn't completely fall apart. And so we can try to address these individually for our next question here. And so thinking about the last part of simply just holding bones together, what kind of structure would support that function?
I don't know. Would a suture count for that or no?
Yeah, so a suture is like the name we use to define that type of joint. And so what would you expect to find in a suture? How is that holding those bones together? And it doesn't have to be directly at Benjamin or at Ben. But what kind of tissues or what kinds of
With cartilage?
that hold things together? So Deacon said cartilage. So yes, cartilage absolutely plays a role in as far as holding things together. We're gonna be talking a lot about cartilage today. I have a slide on the different types, and we're going to talk about where those cartilages show up and the role they play in our various joints. So cartilage, you guys think of any other tissue types that would be helpful in holding things together?
Connective tissue?
Yeah, right. Yes, we are talking about connective tissue in general, of which cartilage is a type. Bones themselves are a type of connective tissue. Okay. Trying to push you guys towards thinking about the specific dense connective tissue, like made up of mainly collagen and elastic fibers, which would be our ligaments. Okay? Ligaments and tendons are very, very similar in that way, big bundles of collagen fibers, and they resist that pulling apart, and so it would be helpful in holding those things together. Right? Ligaments attach bones to bones. Okay. So we've got collagen and dense connective tissue, dense connective fibers as far as holding these bones together. And so how might that be different in places where we need movement? What kinds of structures or things would you expect to see somewhere where bones need to be able to move next to other bones, where they are connected?
Some form of lubrication.
Yeah, right. Lubrication. And a lot of this you can try to think about, applications in real life of non-living things. Anywhere we have hinges and joints and non-living things, they need lubrication oftentimes. And we'll be talking about the lubrication that exists in our movable joints.
Is that synovial fluid?
Yeah, so for our synovial joints, where our most mobile joints, they will have synovial fluid specifically in that space between them. So the second thing I would have been looking for there was space, right? If you've got bones sitting inside of other bones or in those articular surfaces of other bones, and there's no space between them, they're not really going to be able to have any type of movement. And if that space is full of fibers and cartilage, maybe that allows for a little bit of movement. And those fibers and cartilage are also going to help with that compression force and dispersion of weight that was brought up earlier. Okay? And so those are the main things that you'll see showing up in our various joint types. Okay? So where things need to just be held together tightly, it's mainly cartilage and dense connective tissue. Where things need to be able to disperse force, you may have a little bit of fluid and a lot of that connective tissue and maybe some softer cartilage to help with that compression. And then where things need to be movable, you need space. That space is going to be full of synovial fluid, as Ben brought up, and that allows for a lot more of a range of motion. Right? Our glenohumeral joint, which is what I'm rotating right now, provides the largest range of motion. And we have that ball, the head of the humerus sitting in the glenoid labrum or glenoid fossa of the scapula. And that is a ball and socket joint with a whole bunch of fluids, that synovial fluid in between the head of the humerus and the actual bone within that glenoid fossa. And so my humerus can move in basically every direction to a certain extent, right? I can't really go past here without bending my spine, but it provides a wide range of movements. And not very many joints are going to be even close to that. So thank you for thinking through that with me. And so let's expand on that. So like I said, we're going to talk a bit about cartilage here. This was introduced in chapter 4. We didn't talk about it much in the actual PowerPoint and lecture, but cartilage is a type of connective tissue. And we see these different names show up a few times in this chapter. So I want to make sure we address it. So hyaline cartilage is the cartilage type that you guys saw when we were talking about the endochondral ossification of bone. So creating a bone with a hyaline cartilage model, right? The cartilage basically formed the premature shape that the bone would end up taking and then expanding on. These also aid in the sliding within joints. So articular cartilage is another name you're going to show up, which is a type of hyaline cartilage. It's just missing the perichondrium, the outer portion of it. So in most of our movable joints with cartilage lining your bone, that is going to be hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage in our case. Let me even add that in here. Okay. And there's going to be cartilage lining our bones everywhere that they meet. Cartilage is present every single place that there is an articulation, lining the bones in between. So allowing for a little bit of lubrication, even in places that we don't need to move. We then have elastic cartilage, which has a much more gelatinous ground substance with it. It has a lot more of those elastic fibers rather than collagen. So this allows for some more flexible shape and support. And these just show up in our ear and the epiglottis, which is kind of like a flap over your trachea here of just elastic cartilage. It's that like movable portion you can kind of touch on. And interesting, or I find it interesting that the cartilage that makes up our ears is not the same that makes up our nose, right? Because you're probably familiar, like this wasn't a bone that we talked about, the structure of it, those bones stop here. You do have cartilage that makes up the major portion of your bone there, or of your nose. And that is actually a hyaline cartilage that makes up our nose, but we have elastic cartilage that makes up our ear. And so with that knowledge, then thinking about it, kind of touching on it and moving it, you can feel some of the differences in that tissue type. This is a lot softer and a lot more bendy. So even though this moves, it doesn't move nearly as much, right? And feels a little thicker and denser. And then lastly, we have fibrocartilage, which is the most fibrous matrix of these. So hyaline cartilage has a very liquid matrix, right? Like and then elastic cartilage has a more gelatinous ground substance in the matrix. And then fibrocartilage has a very fibrous matrix, lots of those collagen fibers. And so these are useful in places where we need cushioning, strength, and resistance for those connections. So we'll see this show up for our intervertebral discs, which we are going to talk about the structure of briefly here. So there's these discs of fibrocartilage sitting in between, making up the joint in between each of the vertebrae in our vertebral column. These show up in the meniscus or menisci of some of our joints, and then the pubic symphysis, where the pubis of both of your os coxae connect to keep your entire pelvis together. So the main cartilage type that we're going to see show up today is hyaline. This is articular cartilage. We're going to see that name pop up a bunch. And then some fibrocartilage or some reference to fibrocartilage as we move throughout. And so with that in mind, we can then move forward. So we categorize different joints, or all of our articulations, by the type of movement and then their structure, essentially, what makes up that joint. So what is making up a majority of the mass of that connection, basically. And so as far as the movement, the functional category, we have joints that don't move at all. We have joints that move a little bit. And then we have joints that move a whole lot, or free movement. So these are synarthrosis, syn meaning together. So these are the most compact, I suppose, as far as the joints, right? These are holding the joints together the most densely. And so there is no movement or extremely little movement in these joints. These are synarthroses. We have amphiarthroses. Amphi is a prefix that usually means like in between or both. So an amphiarthrosis joint would be the halfway point between our synarthrosis and our diarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis are the middle point. There's a little bit of movement. And then we have our diarthrosis, or the free movement of joints. So those are our three functional categories: no movement, a little bit of movement, or free movement. So synarthrosis for no movement, amphiarthrosis for a little bit of movement, that halfway point, and then diarthrosis for free movement. And so within each of these functional categories, we then have different types of joints with their own names and descriptions that have slightly different structure to them. So we have sutures, like what Ben brought up, which is those cartilage connection models that were in between the bones of our skull, and then they get replaced and ossified during maturation, during our lifespan outside of the womb, until eventually they are basically all bone, just interlocked together with a little bit of cartilage in between and dense fibrous connective tissue holding them. And there's no need for those skull bones to move. In fact, it's most beneficial that they don't move at all because of the very important organ that they are protecting, our brain. We then have gomposes, which describes the type of sockets and joints between our teeth and the mandible, right, that they're sitting in. So again, these are not moving. You don't want your teeth to move. That kind of defeats the purpose of what the teeth are supposed to be doing with chewing our food. We then have synchondrosis. Again, that prefix syn meaning together, and chondrosis referring to the cartilage. These are mainly found, or our best example here would be where the ribs with their costal cartilage are meeting the manubrium. So this really just applies to our first pair of ribs, but it's that cartilage joint connecting that first pair of ribs to the manubrium. Again, no real movement of those ribs. You could try to push on them. Can you? Yeah, you can kind of try to push on them, but of course they don't go anywhere. And then we have synostosis, another rigid, immovable joint. This is kind of an expansion on our idea of sutures. Right. So of those four, no movement, right? I guess the difference between this synostosis and the actual sutures that we were describing before is that sutures do have fibers, those dense fibrous connective tissues, ligaments, kind of holding them together. But this synostosis portion of the suture is completely fused bone. Right? But none of these are movable. Or if they move at all, it should be an extremely, extremely small, insignificant amount of movement. So these are the strongest joint types. And then if we move into our amphiarthrosis, where we have a little bit of movement, we only have two examples here. So syndesmosis, so syn for together, desmosis, referring to things like desmosomes, right? That cellular glue that we were seeing in our epithelial tissue. Right? So just kind of describing how strongly connected these are being held together by that fibrous tissue, by ligaments. Okay? So think about like the articulation between the tibia and fibula. Right? Those bones don't really need to move very much next to each other. And you might think also the radius and the ulna, but those joints are actually considered a synovial joint, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Your radius does rotate around the ulna when you pronate and supinate your arm like this. It's kind of hard to do from where I'm standing, but when you pronate and supinate your arm like this, you are rotating your radius around the ulna at the proximal radial-ulnar joint here. But your tibia and fibula don't do nearly that same range of motion. And then our symphysis, referring to the pubic symphysis, this is a cartilaginous joint there that does have a little bit of movement, allows for that compression and that distribution of weight as you're moving, holding your two pubic bones together there. And then finally, our last category, which is where we're going to be spending most of our time here today, because that's where because we have a whole lot of different types of movement that we can talk about with them. These are our diarthroses joints, which are our synovial joints. Synovial joints are going to have synovial fluid in it, right? Allowing for that space and that cushioning, that lubrication to provide movement, like what I was doing with my arms. Really anything that is freely moving on your appendages is going to be some type of synovial joint. And we can further separate that or categorize that even further by what types of movement are possible. So a monoaxial, meaning movement in one plane. So either back and forth or side to side, just one plane, one two-dimensional plane that they can move along. Biaxial, meaning there's two planes, and then triaxial, typically or specifically referring to three planes, but really these are what you think about or where we have joints that can really move in like circles. right? Because they have a three-dimensional plane that they can move on, it's really in any direction almost that they're able to move. And that's really just the shoulder and the hip. So where our largest long bones are intersecting with the axial skeleton, where our appendicular skeleton meets the axial skeleton, we have those two triaxial synovial joints that allow for the most movement possible. Any questions or pieces of clarification on our categorizing of types of joints here?
I was wondering, can you give examples of joints in each category, like monaxial, diaxial, and triaxial?
Yeah, we're going to talk about a lot of them today, actually. Like I said, basically the rest of this slide deck is all on synovial joints. So yes, we will be talking about examples. Just a second. Okay. So before we move on, I know I mentioned this in lab last week, but just want to make sure we bring this up again. The structure of tendons and ligaments is really, really similar. They're just different in what is being connected to what. Okay, so these are dense connective fibers, excuse me, mostly made up of collagen, a little bit of elastin. But a tendon connects muscle to a skeletal, to the bone, to the skeleton, right? And a ligament connects bone to bone. So tendons are on muscles, ligaments connect bone to bone. But the structure of them is quite similar. But so with most of what we're talking about today, with these articulations, with our joints, we're looking at bones meeting other bones. Most of the dense connective tissue that is supporting that structure is going to be a ligament. The tendons are there, do provide some support, but are also mainly connecting the muscle onto them. Okay. So here's our first look at a typical synovial joint. I don't think I have many notes in this PowerPoint, so I don't know if this is necessary. Okay, our typical synovial joint. Okay. So we have long bones meeting other long bones in this example here. So we're going to have our space filled with fluid that we were talking about, our synovial fluid in this little joint cavity. We have articular cartilage, just going to line. Again, every meeting between bones is going to have some sort of cartilage lining that spot, with some exceptions for our synarthroses joints. So joint cavity containing fluid to allow for that lubrication, providing space, articular cartilage, which is a type of hyaline cartilage, providing that sliding. We have our synovial membrane surrounding this joint cavity, which is going to be made up of cells that are producing that synovial fluid to fill this space up. And then our other structures to look at are coming up later. So again, the main point here is that the synovial fluid here is providing lubrication and providing space. Articular cartilage is quite slidey and slick. So even if this fluid gets compressed and the bones do touch each other, they should generally be able to slide and distribute force that way. And then the synovial membrane has cells that are going to be generating that synovial fluid to fill up that space and replenish it. So other structures you would find in a synovial membrane are things like our menisci, or a single meniscus, which is either going to be a pad of fibrocartilage, that very fibrous version of cartilage, or fat tissue, so adipose tissue. And where are some menisci here? These kind of fill some of the angular gaps that show up in these joints, like what we see here of our example knee joint. We have this triangular shaped meniscus here and triangular shaped meniscus there, kind of changing the angle of how these two meet. We will have a fat pad, which, as it sounds, is a pad full of adipose tissue to help with that support and distribution of weight. We have our ligaments connecting those bones, providing strength and a little bit of flexibility. And then we have some bursa, or bursae for the plural, which are little sacs full of liquid. Similarly, just allowing for some lubrication and some distribution of force at certain points. We have like 4 or 5 of them showing up in this image. And so these are also going to be full of that synovial fluid the same way that our joint cavity was. These bursae have more of that synovial fluid to help again with that lubrication, the distribution of force allowing for more sliding in these areas. Is there anything I should add on to that? If people have some more clinical knowledge or application, is there a better way I can talk about the application or the function that these different structures serve? Okay. Just double checking. I mentioned in lab, right? My dog has torn both of the equivalent of his ACLs in his knees. And he's gotten surgery on both of them. The second surgery was done by a veterinarian who wasn't trained in this, and it went poorly, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, he was having more issues, and we found that because that surgery had been done poorly, he was putting extra strain on the menisci of his knee, and that ended up causing even more pain. Those ended up with really big tears in them, and they just had to go in there and pull them out. So it's another part of this connection and holding this whole structure together that can cause a very similar pain, very similar impact, and a very similar surgery to kind of fix it, kind of removing those tears. Anyways. Okay, so moving on to types of movement. So we're going to talk about the monoaxial, the biaxial, and the triaxial, and what those mean and the specific name for those types of movements all along the way. But basically, we can simplify it to these kind of 5 types. We do have a lot of terms describing some specific movements, like the movement of the feet with plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, and we've got supination and pronation of the forearms, etc. But most of them are following some sort of version of this model. So we have some gliding movement, which you can think about this pencil without lifting the tip of the pencil, moving up, down, left, and right. So vertically or horizontally away from the tip there. And so this type of gliding movement is most common where like flat bones meet other flat bones. And they can shift a little bit, but don't do a whole lot of rotation or other angles. We've got angular motion where the tip would remain stationary here, but the eraser is moving away from that tip, right? So creating larger angles. Think about like a pivot. If you're keeping something still and pivoting off of that into different angles, that's angular motion. Circumduction is a type of that angular motion where we have like rotation with it. So this is a type of circumduction, right? Something circular, but still that point, that tip of the pencil is in the same spot, and just rotating around that tip. And then we have rotation. So like I'm rotating my skull and neck right now, where the tip is staying still, the plane or axis that the rest of that bone is on isn't really changing. I'm just rotating around that axis. I'm moving my head. Okay? Whereas this would be a type of like circumduction. Okay, so what does that look like in the different parts of our bodies and on our various joints? Okay? So basically in anatomical position, all of your joints are at extension with the exception of your ankle. Because our anatomical position has us standing on a solid ground, our ankle is actually flexed up to hold our body in that position, but every other joint is at extension. They have been extended to the point where they, for most of our joints, that is the farthest they should go without risking damage. We can get some hyperextension for some of our more mobile portions of our body. We can hyperextend our neck by going beyond this point of extension, going backwards. If we push our neck and head forwards, that would be flexion. So flexion is typically bringing it closer to, or I guess, sorry, I wasn't going to describe that correctly. Let's just read what I have here. So flexion is movement in the anterior posterior plane that reduces the angle between articulating elements. Sorry, I'm thinking for a second because I don't necessarily like that as being sufficient enough, because just thinking about the angle, like if this is hyperextension and the articulating element is my head on the neck, this angle got reduced. So how do I know that that's hyperextension versus flexion? I guess I don't know a really good trick for that. I guess it seems like most flexion is anterior. So moving my head down towards the front, moving my arms up towards the front, that is anterior movements, reducing that angle, as flexion and extension or hyperextension is typically posteriorly backwards. Right? And I think that should be true. It should be true in every case that we're talking about.
Except for the knee joint, I think.
What?
For the knee joint, that would not hold true.
It would not hold true for the knee. Oh yeah, because hyperextension would be anterior. But can it even hyperextend? I don't know. Can we technically hyperextend the knee?
I think we can, but that would cause injury.
It would injure it, right? Okay. So, but yes, good point, right? In anatomical position, the knee is facing forward. Hyperextension would be moving that knee forward. But yeah, like Constance said, that would injure it. So I think that general idea should ring true, at least as far as the movement that those joints should be capable of without risking injury. Flexing a joint should bring it anteriorly, should bring those elements anteriorly. Hyperextending it should bring it posteriorly, like what you see with the hip joint being hyperextended posteriorly, the neck being hyperextended posteriorly, even our wrist here being hyperextended posteriorly in anatomical position and flexed anteriorly. And then for our ankle joints, we just talk about flexion as two different types of flexion. We have plantar and dorsiflexion, which we'll see in a second. Okay. So then we have abduction and adduction. And I was talking to James and Ben about this in class of trying to figure out the best memorization techniques for getting these two or separating these two because they're very similar, obviously abd and add. The way that I've used for the longest time is just the idea that when you add things together, you bring them together. And so adduction is bringing those limbs or whatever elements closer together. You're adding them together. But also this morning, I thought about like the term abduction in any other context besides talking about movements. To abduct something is to take it away. Right? So if you were abducted, you were taken away. Right? I know it's kind of dark, but if you were abducted, you've been taken away, stolen away. So abduction is taking those elements away from the midline. Adduction is bringing them together towards the midline. And so you can also abduct and adduct your fingers. Some of us can abduct and adduct our toes. Right? So circumduction, circle, circle. Circumduction is any type of that circular movement, like what you see in this image here. We then have our different rotations. So when you're rotating something that is on the side of your body, you can describe that rotation as lateral or medial, or often commonly external or internal, right? Following those positions. So if I rotate my arm externally, right, I'm pushing out or laterally towards the lateral side of my body. And if I rotate it medially or internally, right, the point of direction of what's moving is going towards my body. And so that is lateral and medial rotation of my shoulder joint, right? Even though my wrist may be moving as I'm doing it, that joint itself is actually still while I'm doing this. I'm just rotating the ball in the socket of this glenohumeral joint. Movement of the radial ulnar joint of our forearm is pronation when it's going medial and supination going laterally. So here, my shoulder itself, I'm trying to be close enough where this is visible, but while I'm supinating and pronating, my shoulder is not moving at all or barely moving because it's hard to just control one or the other, but I'm getting a lot of rotation of my forearm here around that radial ulnar joint. My radius is rotating around the ulna. And so pronation is bringing the thumb towards the midline. Supination is bringing it laterally, so back to anatomical position. Pronation, supination. If anyone can think of memorization techniques for that pronation and supination part, let me know. Thought I had something, but then it went away. Okay, so at our ankle joint, we have a couple unique types of movements. So our ankle can invert and evert. And for me, I think about the bottom of my foot as being the thing to pay attention to. And if I'm inverting my ankle joint, the bottom of my foot is going in. And if I'm everting my ankle joint, the bottom of my foot is going out. So inversion is that kind of almost rotation inwards. Eversion is that rotation outwards of this ankle joint. But putting the bottom of the foot facing in for inversion, the bottom of the foot facing out for eversion. And then we have our two types of flexion at the ankle joint. Right? So this is technically extension versus flexion, but we call them plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Okay? So bringing the toes superiorly, so upwards, is dorsiflexion. You can think about the dorsal fin of a dolphin or any other aquatic mammal, right? The dorsal fin would be facing the sky. Dorsiflexion is bringing that ankle joint upwards towards where that dorsal fin would be. And then plantar flexion is downwards, and that's technically extending the ankle joints. But we call it plantar flexion as well. So plantar flexion, bringing it towards the ground, towards the plants and the soil. Plantar flexion towards the plants, dorsiflexion towards the dorsal fin. I don't know, hopefully that works. Okay, then have opposition of these finger joints here, bringing opposite limbs towards each other. In this case, our phalanges towards each other. This is opposition. Trying to think if there's other examples of that type of movement. But none are coming to the top of my head. So this is the only example I would expect you to recognize for this opposition. That's what's in the textbook. We talked about retraction and protraction yesterday in lab of our mandible, of our jawbone here. So protraction going out, moving that jaw out, and then retraction, bringing it back in. And then we talked about depression and elevation as well. So depressing the mandible downwards inferiorly, elevating the mandible superiorly, bringing it higher, elevation. And then we have lateral flexion. So most of the flexion examples we were looking at were on the vertical plane, going anteriorly or posteriorly. But then we do have lateral flexion, like what we can do with our neck, and the muscles we were talking about yesterday play a role in some of that lateral flexion, right? The trapezius, if one side of your trapezius is flexing, the other one is going to extend, and that allows for that lateral flexion. And so these are the main movement names that you would be asked to potentially recognize from an image. Okay? So if you were given an image without, obviously without the name being labeled here, with just the arrows and a circle telling you what joint is moving, can you identify that type of movement from that image?
Is lateral flexion then just tilting, or?
No, I mean, like you're fully flex. I mean, whatever makes sense to you in that way. Like if putting this as tilting allows you to make that memorization together, but it is fully flexing the muscles on this side of your neck. And you can feel them flex as you do it.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit confused about the difference between the circular and the rotational motion. Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah. So let me actually use this. Okay. So if we're comparing the tip of the pencil, where the lead would be, to the eraser, with circumduction, the eraser is like moving in space, right? So this is circumduction, where if my hand is the eraser, right, I am going into different areas, moving along all the planes as I rotate here. But then for rotation, the eraser isn't necessarily moving in space. It is just changing side. I'm trying to think of how to say it without saying rotating. But what's rotating here is the ball that's in the socket, right? All these bones that are in that. And then for circumduction, they're going throughout different planes.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, any other questions here, guys? All right. So we introduced the idea of monoaxial, diaxial, triaxial. These actually don't themselves have their own individual type because we have different types of monoaxial or monoaxial, diaxial, and triaxial joints. I'm trying to think of how to like segue this well. It's just another, we have more subcategorization of joints to talk about. So we have 6 main types of synovial joints that can follow those different axes, or different types of movement along those axes. So we have our gliding joints, our hinge joints, our pivot joints, our ellipsoidal joints. There's another name for this that is escaping me right now. I'm sure I'll remember it soon because that word ellipsoidal is weird. So ellipsoidal, we have a saddle joint and then our ball and socket joints. And so we only have 2 of those ball and socket joints, as I pointed out earlier. It's where our appendicular skeleton is meeting the axial skeleton, essentially, or meeting the girdles, right? So where our humerus meets the scapula and where our femur is meeting the os coxa. Those are both ball and socket joints, and they are the most mobile of these synovial joints, with the shoulder joint in particular being the most mobile. Right? You can move your legs in lots of different directions on lots of different planes, but not quite to the extent that you can with your arms. You can go all over the place in that ball and socket. All right, so those are the most mobile, with specifically the glenohumeral joint being the most mobile joint in the body. I think I even put that on the slide. Yeah, this has the greatest range of motion for mobility. This joint here, glenohumeral joint, or shoulder. And then the hip would be the second most. So this is our only triaxial, where you can really go in a 3-dimensional movement at that joint, right? Anywhere in that 3-dimensional space. We then have these 2 examples of biaxial movement at our ellipsoidal joints and saddle joints. And so they can move front, back, side to side, so 2 different planes. It's not necessarily at that distinct thing, but think 90-degree angles in between them. So front to back, side to side, 2 different planes. That makes them biaxial, but with a slightly different structure to how that joint is set up. So this ellipsoidal joint looks kind of similar to the ball and socket, right? We have kind of a circular head being sat into some sort of fossa or cavity. But in this case, it's flat bones on flat bones, essentially, besides the radiocarpal joint. So where the carpals meet the radius has this kind of side-to-side motion. I'm trying to think if you can really feel that. That's kind of tough to really, we can do this. Oh yeah, there we go. You can do that side-to-side motion at that joint, right at the wrist. Where the metacarpals meet the phalanges and the metatarsals meet the phalanges are that same type of joint. Okay, so where your fingers and toes are meeting the rest of your hand can move in both of those directions, right? I can move my finger left to right, then down and back, almost similar to a ball and socket joint, but not quite the same range of motion. And then we have our saddle joint, which is really only in our first metacarpal, or where the first metacarpal meets the carpal here, the trapezium. So where your thumb, where that metacarpal meets the trapezium, it has a structure like this, where that joint of your metacarpal is kind of sitting around almost a axis, but that's the same word I'm using again. How would you describe this? Kind of like a saddle? Oh yeah, it's called a saddle joint. It is a saddle. So where that metacarpal is meeting the carpal, it's kind of sitting around it like a saddle, right? Which does still allow for that 2-dimensional movement. And then for our joints with less movement, we have our 2 monaxial joints, which are pivot and hinge. So our pivot joints are where our atlas meets the axis, so where C1 meets C2, allowing for your head to rotate around without your whole vertebral column needing to rotate. So it allows for that rotation at that pivot joint. It's also what allows for supination and pronation of my forearm, right, at the proximal radial ulnar joint. This allows for rotation simply on that one plane. Each of our hinge joints, which makes sense as a hinge, our elbows, knees, our ankles, the joints in between your phalanges. So when you're bending your fingers, right, those are your hinge joints, or bending your toes, those are your hinge joints in your phalanges. Okay? So these have a hinge. They move in one direction along that hinge. Right? I can't move my forearm side to side without moving my shoulder joint. If I keep my shoulder joint still, I have no ability to move my forearm side to side. I can just go up and down, extension and flexion. And then lastly, we have some gliding joints. These would either barely, or most often are barely moving at all, but do allow for a little bit of movements, like where our clavicle meets our manubrium, the intercarpal and intertarsal joints, so the flat bones of your wrists and ankles where they meet each other. The vertebrocostal joints, so where your vertebra meeting or are articulating with the cartilage, and then our sacroiliac joint. Again, these are not super mobile, but do allow for a little bit of that sliding along each other. So like rubbing my hands like this, like I slide my hands side to side, up and down, like sliding together on that plane. But most of them are non-axial. Or not most of them are non-axial, but some of them do not really follow that same axis, kind of move away from each other. Sorry if I'm not explaining that well. Are there any questions I could use to try to talk about this stuff better? Or is this making at least somewhat sense? Constance, you're muted if you're talking.
Oh, is the sacroiliac joint a synarthrosis or a synovial?
It's a synovial. Yeah, these are all of these movement types at these joints that we're talking about. These are all synovial joints.
Okay, and for your biaxial joint, you put down the first carpal metacarpal joint, but how about the rest of the carpal metacarpal joints from the index to the ring finger and the little finger? Would that be biaxial as well to allow for abduction and adduction as well as flexion and extension?
Yeah, so they didn't have it, like this is just a figure out of the textbook. Like I didn't put these in here. And that also stood out to me as like, what about the rest of the carpal metacarpal joints? So I'm trying to think logically, I think they may be ellipsoidal, but that is something we need to look up. So let's figure this out. Okay, I may need to do research outside of class to not take up too much class time here. Yeah, I will get back to you because I don't know why they aren't listed in here. They are. I'm very confident they are synovial joints because of how much we can move them on that axis. But as far as the movement being different from our first metacarpal, I don't really understand why or how. So we will expand on that. I guess we don't have class on Thursday, so I'll either have that answer for you next Tuesday or I'll talk about it in lab tomorrow, or both. Maybe we'll talk about it both. That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Any other questions? Okay. So I don't intend to go through each of these slides because most of it would just be me reading the structures that are on there. We've already talked about what all these structures do, the bursae, the cartilage cavity, or sorry, the fluid cavity, etc. I think the intervertebral disc is cool to talk about. That's what's sitting in between each of our vertebrae. And so we kind of have this outer annulus fibrosis, which is made up of mainly fibers, like those collagen fibers. And then we have a more elastic gelatinous nucleus that pulposus. in the center, which allows for that resistance of that of compression, right? Keeps the space between our vertebrae, allows them to kind of rotate with each other when we're doing bigger movements of our whole body, without causing damage and preventing that rubbing. Right? So shock absorption, preventing that rubbing, allowing for a little bit of flexibility and movement between our spine. And these deteriorate over time. So over time, that's why old people are expected to get shorter as these intervertebral discs start to break down and are taking up less and less space in between the vertebrae, and thus we become less and less mobile as well over time as those compress and more of our bones start to rub against each other in that vertebral column. But yeah, the rest of this, right, it's just pointing out all these specific ligaments, tendons, etc., that are part of like our glenohumeral joints, the acromioclavicular joints. Still looking at those. Here we're looking at where the femur meets the hip, right? Our hip joint, our elbow, the knee. And honestly, this content is more useful or is going to be addressed as far as lab stuff. So we talked about, or the joints were on your lab list of stuff to know for last week. So these slides are straight from the textbook from stuff that should help with that. But yeah, like I said, I don't just want to read this stuff to you, but they are here. So are there any questions about joint types and movement types for us to review or try to dive deeper into? Okay. Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming today. And I appreciate all the participation in my early little reflection activity. I will look up what types of joints the rest of the carpometacarpal joints are, so that we have an answer to that question. And I should have that for you by tomorrow. Please remember that we do not have class on Thursday. The college is closed for Professional Development Day. All of our Faculty Development Day. So all the faculty will be in class as learners, kind of flipping the script that way. And so I'll see you tomorrow for lab, where we'll talk about the muscles of the shoulder and arm. And then I won't see you again until the next Monday. So unless you have any questions, concerns, or comments, you guys are free to go. I hope you have a great afternoon and weekend, or great afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Prof.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. Professor, I didn't see the PowerPoint. Have you uploaded that or not yet?
Yes, it should be uploaded.
It-
Oh, you're right. It's not in the module.
Uh-oh.
The file has been on campus for a while, but I didn't realize I failed to put it in the module. So I will get that in there right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Problem. So it should be there now.
Maybe it takes a while. I can check later. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be in its usual spot in the module. Sorry that I didn't catch that earlier.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.